The sun hung low over Kanoya Air Base in the spring of 1945, casting long shadows across the runway where rows of aircraft stood waiting like silent sentinels. Among them, Mitsubishi A6M-0 fighters bore fresh coats of paint, their engines maintained for what would be their final flights. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto stood at the edge of the tarmac, his hands clasped behind his back, watching mechanics make last-minute adjustments to the aircraft. At 23, he had already lived longer than most pilots in the special attack units, though not by choice or design, but by a series of accidents and circumstances that had begun to feel like either a cruel joke or divine intervention. The wind carried the smell of aviation fuel and salt from the nearby ocean. Takeshi closed his eyes and let the breeze wash over his face, wondering if this would be the day his luck finally ran out. 3 times he had taken off on kamikaze missions. 3 times he had returned, each time with a different excuse, each time met with increasingly suspicious glares from his commanding officers and quiet whispers from fellow pilots who couldn't decide if he was blessed or cursed. Behind him, footsteps approached on the concrete. Takeshi didn't need to turn around to recognize the heavy gait of Commander Nakamura, a man whose face had been hardened by 2 years of watching young men fly to their deaths with smiles painted on their faces. The commander stopped beside him, arms crossed over his chest, his uniform crisp despite the humid air. "Yamamoto," Nakamura said, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken accusations. "Tomorrow you will fly again." "Yes, sir." Takeshi's response was automatic, practiced. "This will be your 4th sortie." The commander paused, letting the number hang in the air between them. In the special attack units, there were no 4th missions. There were barely 2nd ones. "Some of the men are beginning to talk. They say you lack the spirit of the warrior, that you dishonor the emperor with your continued survival." Takeshi felt his jaw tighten, but kept his eyes fixed on the aircraft before them. "I have never turned back willingly, sir. The first mission, my engine failed 30 kilometers from the target. The second, I was intercepted by American fighters, and my aircraft was too damaged to continue. The third time you claimed poor visibility prevented you from locating the enemy fleet," Nakamura interrupted, his tone sharp. "Yet 3 other pilots from your squadron found their targets that day." The accusation hung heavy between them. Takeshi had no defense that would satisfy the commander, because part of what Nakamura said was true. During that 3rd mission, when clouds had obscured his view of the ocean below, when he had circled for over an hour, searching for the American ships, there had been a moment when he could have descended, when the clouds had briefly parted to reveal destroyer formations in the distance. But his hands had frozen on the controls. His mind had rebelled against the command to dive, and by the time he had overcome that moment of paralysis, the weather had closed in again, providing him with a legitimate excuse to return to base. "Tomorrow will be different," Takeshi said quietly. "I will not return." Nakamura studied him for a long moment, then placed a hand on his shoulder. When he spoke again, his voice had softened slightly. "I knew your father, Yamamoto. He was a good man, a brave man. He died honorably at Midway, giving his life for the Emperor and for Japan. I know you carry that burden with you." After the commander walked away, Takeshi remained standing at the edge of the runway until the sun had fully set and the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. He thought about his father, about the telegram that had arrived 3 years ago, about his mother's quiet tears that had fallen like rain for weeks afterward. He thought about honor and duty and the photographs of smiling pilots that lined the walls of the squadron's common room, young men who had successfully completed their one-way missions, who were now venerated as heroes and gods. That night, in the barracks, sleep eluded him. Around him, other pilots lay in their bunks, some snoring softly, others staring at the ceiling with wide eyes that reflected the dim moonlight filtering through the windows. In the bunk next to his, Ensign Koji Tanaka, just 19 years old, tossed and turned, his breathing shallow and quick. "Yamamoto-san," Koji whispered into the darkness. "Are you awake?" "Yes." "Is it true what they say? That you've flown 3 times and come back?" Takeshi hesitated before answering. "It's true." A long silence followed. Then, barely audible, Koji asked, "What is it like, taking off, knowing you won't return?" "I don't know," Takeshi admitted, "because I did return. Each time I thought it would be the end. Each time something happened to prevent it. Some of the men say you're lucky, others say you're a coward." Koji's voice trembled slightly. "I fly tomorrow too. My first mission. I'm terrified, Yamamoto-san. I don't want to die." The raw honesty in those words struck Takeshi like a physical blow. How many others felt this way but dared not speak it? How many young men had climbed into their cockpits with terror in their hearts, masking it behind forced smiles and brave words because that was what was expected, what was demanded? "Fear is natural," Takeshi said carefully. "Our training has taught us to overcome it, to channel it into dedication and purpose. But you've felt it, haven't you? That moment when you realize this is really happening, that you're really going to die. What did you do with that fear?" Takeshi rolled onto his side to face the younger pilot, though he could barely make out his features in the darkness. "I held on to it," he said honestly. "I held on to it, and I let it keep me alive. And I don't know if that makes me a coward or simply human." Morning came too quickly, announced by the harsh sound of the wake-up bell that echoed through the barracks. The pilots rose mechanically, moving through their routines with practiced efficiency. Breakfast was a simple meal of rice, miso soup and pickled vegetables, eaten in near silence. Those who were scheduled to fly that day were given an extra portion, along with sake and ceremonial rice wrapped in leaves bearing prayers and blessings. Takeshi watched as Koji struggled to eat, his hands shaking slightly as he brought the rice bowl to his lips. Across the table, Lieutenant Hiroshi Saito, a decorated pilot who had shot down 7 American aircraft before volunteering for the Special Attack Units, ate with calm determination, his face betraying no emotion. Saito was 25, ancient by the standards of their unit, and had chosen this path after losing his younger brother at Guadalcanal. "Yamamoto," Saito said, setting down his bowl, "I hear you fly again today?" "Yes." "Good. Perhaps today you'll finally complete what you've started 3 times already." There was no malice in Saito's voice, only a strange kind of weariness. "Or perhaps the Americans will shoot you down and spare you the decision." "Saito-san?" Koji looked shocked at the older pilot's words, but Saito only smiled sadly. "Tanaka-kun, you're young. You still believe in the nobility of what we do, in the glory and honor. That's good. Hold on to that belief. It will make it easier when the time comes." He turned back to Takeshi. "But Yamamoto here knows the truth, don't you? You know that we're throwing ourselves against their ships like moths against a flame, that our sacrifice, however noble, may not be enough to turn the tide of this war." "Then why do you go?" Takeshi asked quietly. "Because even if it changes nothing, even if Japan still falls, I want to look my brother in the eyes when I meet him again and tell him I did everything I could. I want that more than I want to live." Saito stood, gathering his tray. "The question is, what do you want, Yamamoto? What do you want badly enough to either die for it or live for it?" After breakfast, the pilots scheduled for that day's missions gathered in the briefing room. Commander Nakamura stood at the front, a large map of the Pacific pinned to the wall behind him. showing the positions of American naval forces approaching Okinawa. Red circles marked areas where previous attacks had scored hits. Black X's indicated where pilots had last reported enemy positions before completing their missions. Intelligence reports indicate a large carrier group approximately 200 kilometers southeast of here, Nakamura began, using a pointer to indicate the position on the map. This is your target. The Americans have intensified their air patrols, so you will face heavy fighter opposition. Yamamoto, Saito, you will lead the first wave with 4 pilots each. Tanaka, you will be part of Yamamoto's formation. Takeshi felt Koji stiffen beside him at the mention of his name. The young pilot's breathing had become shallow again, and Takeshi could see his hands gripping the edge of the bench where they sat. Nakamura continued with tactical details: approach altitude, radio frequencies, identification signals for friendly forces. The words washed over Takeshi like water, familiar and routine. He had heard this briefing 3 times before, had memorized every detail, every contingency. What Nakamura didn't brief them on was what to do when doubt crept into your mind at 10,000 feet, when your entire body screamed at you to pull up instead of dive down, when every instinct for survival warred against your orders and your duty. You will depart at 0900 hours, Nakamura concluded. Take your positions now. Pilots, prepare your aircraft. Ground crews, final inspections. Dismissed. The room emptied slowly. Some pilots moved with steady determination, others with visible reluctance, disguised as careful deliberation. Outside the briefing room, families had gathered to see their sons off. Takeshi saw Koji's parents standing near the entrance, his mother clutching a small bundle wrapped in cloth, his father standing rigid in his civilian suit, trying to maintain composure. Takeshi had asked his mother not to come anymore. After the 3rd return, after seeing the mixture of relief and shame in her eyes, he couldn't bear to put her through it again. She had written him letters instead, careful words that spoke of pride and duty, while the ink was sometimes smudged by tears she had tried to hide. As they walked toward the flight line, Saito fell into step beside Takeshi. "I've been thinking about what I said at breakfast," the older pilot said. "I shouldn't have been so harsh." "You spoke the truth." "Perhaps. But truth is a luxury we can't always afford." Saito lit a cigarette, taking a long drag before continuing. "I've been watching you, Yamamoto, for months now. Every time you come back, I see something in your eyes. Not fear exactly, but something else. Conflict. You're at war with yourself, and that's a battle you can't win. And you? Are you at peace with your decision?" Saito laughed, a bitter sound. "Peace? No, but I've made my choice and I won't turn back from it. You, though, you haven't truly chosen yet. You've let circumstances decide for you. Engine failure, fighter interception, bad weather. You've let fate keep you alive without committing to either dying or surviving." They reached Takeshi's aircraft, a Zero fighter loaded with a 250-kilogram bomb beneath its fuselage. The mechanics had painted a rising sun on the side, and someone had written "Wind of Heaven" in kanji on the cowling. The irony wasn't lost on Takeshi. The divine wind was supposed to protect Japan, yet here they were, turning themselves into the wind, hoping their bodies and machines would be enough to turn back the American tide. "Today I choose," Takeshi said quietly, running his hand along the Zero's wing. "One way or another, this ends today." Saito studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. Whatever you decide, commit to it fully. Half measures serve no one, least of all yourself." He clasped Takeshi's shoulder briefly before moving to his own aircraft 3 planes down. Koji appeared at Takeshi's side, his face pale but determined. His mother had given him a seninbari, a 1,000-stitch belt sewn by women who had each added a stitch as a prayer for his protection. He clutched it in his hands like a lifeline. "Yamamoto-san," Koji said, his voice steadier than it had been earlier. "I wanted to thank you for being honest with me last night, for not pretending this is easy or glorious. Koji-kun, No, please let me finish." The young pilot looked down at the belt in his hands. "My whole life, everyone has told me that dying for the Emperor is the highest honor, and I believe that. I do. But you're the only one who's admitted that it's also terrifying. That fear doesn't make us weak. It makes us human." He looked up, meeting Takeshi's eyes. "I'm still afraid. But somehow, knowing that even you are afraid makes it bearable." Takeshi wanted to tell him not to go, wanted to grab him by the shoulders and tell him to run, to refuse, to choose life over this choreographed death. But what right did he have to say such things? He who had already failed 3 times to do what this boy was about to attempt for the first time? "Fly well, Koji-kun," was all he managed to say. The pre-flight checks were completed with mechanical precision. Oil levels, fuel gauge, control surfaces, radio equipment. Everything had to be perfect for a one-way flight. The ground crew worked with quiet efficiency, their faces betraying no emotion as they prepared aircraft they knew would never return. At 08:45, Commander Nakamura emerged from the operations building and strode to where the pilots stood by their planes. He carried a tray with 8 small cups of sake, one for each pilot in the first wave. The ritual was performed with solemn ceremony. Each pilot stepped forward, accepted their cup, drank the rice wine in one swallow, then bowed deeply to the commander. When it was Takeshi's turn, Nakamura looked him directly in the eyes. "Today you carry the hopes of the Emperor and the prayers of your ancestors. Do not dishonor them again." The sake burned going down, but Takeshi welcomed the sensation. Something real, something physical to anchor him, as his mind threatened to spiral into darkness. At 08:55 the order came to mount up. Takeshi climbed into his cockpit, settling into the familiar seat, checking his harness, adjusting his goggles. Around him the other pilots did the same. Through the canopy he could see Koji 3 planes down, going through his own preparations with exaggerated care, drawing out each moment, making it last. The Zero's engine coughed to life, then roared with power as Takeshi advanced the throttle. The vibration travelled through the entire aircraft, through his seat, up his spine. He had felt this sensation hundreds of times during training, dozens of times in combat, 3 times before on missions meant to end in death. But this time felt different. This time, as Sato had said, he had chosen. He had committed. The question was, what had he committed to? At 0900 precisely, Saito's plane began rolling down the runway. One by one, the other aircraft followed. Takeshi watched them go, counting them off, until it was his turn. He released the brakes and felt the Zero surge forward, picking up speed, the runway blurring beneath him. At precisely the right moment, he pulled back on the stick, and the aircraft lifted smoothly into the air. Koji followed shortly after, his takeoff slightly rough, overcorrecting as he left the ground. The formation assembled over the airfield, 8 aircraft forming into 2 groups of 4. Sato led the first group to the left, Takeshi the second to the right. They circled once over the base, a final farewell, then turned southeast toward the open ocean and the American fleet that waited somewhere beyond the horizon. The flight over water was serene at first, blue sky above, darker blue ocean below, the sun warm on the canopy. At cruising altitude the war seemed distant, almost unreal. Takeshi could see the other aircraft in his formation, Koji on his left wing, Ensign Yamada and Sergeant Okada on his right. 4 young men in 4 aircraft, carrying enough explosives to cripple a warship if they could reach their targets. Radio silence was mandatory until they sighted the enemy, so they flew without communication, alone with their thoughts. Takeshi found his mind wandering to memories of his childhood, of summer days spent fishing with his father before the war, before everything changed. His father had been patient and kind, teaching him not just how to fish, but how to read the water, how to understand the currents and the weather, how to be at peace with nature. The ocean doesn't care about human conflicts, his father had told him once. It existed long before us and will exist long after. When you feel overwhelmed by life, remember that. Remember that there are forces greater than war, greater than empires, greater than any single human struggle. At the time, Takeshi had been 10 years old and hadn't fully understood. Now, flying over this vast expanse of water toward an enemy fleet, toward death or dishonor, or something undefined between the two, his father's words resonated with new meaning. 30 minutes into the flight, Saito's voice crackled over the radio. "Enemy fighters, 11 o'clock high." Takeshi snapped to attention, scanning the sky in the indicated direction. At first he saw nothing, then caught the glint of sunlight on metal. American Hellcats, at least 6 of them, diving towards Saito's formation from out of the sun. The Japanese had been spotted. "Break and engage," Saito commanded, and his formation scattered. Takeshi's instinct was to turn and fight, years of combat training screaming at him to jettison the bomb and engage the enemy fighters. But kamikaze pilots weren't supposed to fight. Their mission was singular: reach the fleet, hit a ship, die with honor. Dogfighting was a distraction, a waste of precious fuel and time. "Stay in formation," Takeshi commanded into his radio. "Maintain course. The target is ahead." But Saito's group was already engaged. Takeshi watched as the Hellcats tore into them like wolves among sheep. The kamikaze aircraft, heavy with bombs and limited in maneuverability, were easy prey. 1-0 burst into flames immediately, spiraling down toward the ocean trailing black smoke. Takeshi couldn't tell who it was. "More fighters, 6 o'clock." Yamada's panicked voice cut through the radio chatter. Takeshi craned his neck to look behind and saw them. 4 more Hellcats, diving on his formation from the rear. The Americans had set a perfect trap, catching them between 2 groups of fighters. "Evasive action!" Takeshi shouted, banking hard to the left. The other 3 aircraft in his formation scattered. Tracer rounds streaked past Takeshi's canopy, bright lines of death in the blue sky. He pushed the Zero into a steep dive, the engine screaming, his body pressed back against the seat by the G-forces. The Hellcat followed, its superior speed allowing it to close the distance. More tracers whipped past, and Takeshi felt the aircraft shudder as several rounds struck the fuselage. He pulled out of the dive barely 50 meters above the ocean, so low he could see the whitecaps on the waves. The Hellcat overshot, unable to match the Zero's tight turn radius. Takeshi pulled back on the stick, climbing again, searching for his formation. What he saw made his blood run cold. Yamada's plane was gone, disappeared completely. Okada's Zero was trailing smoke, trying desperately to maintain altitude, while a Hellcat circled above like a vulture. And Koji's aircraft was spinning out of control, smoke pouring from the engine, the young pilot's voice screaming over the radio in terror and pain. "Mayday! Mayday! I'm hit! I can't control!" The transmission cut off as the Zero hit the water and exploded in a ball of fire and debris. Takeshi felt something break inside him. Not fear, not even grief, but a cold, crystalline clarity. He thought of Koji's mother, giving her son a Seninbari belt sewn with prayers. He thought of the boy's admission in the darkness of the barracks, I don't want to die. He thought of all the young men who had climbed into cockpits across the Pacific, Japanese and American both, and never climbed out again. All of this, the divine wind, the sacrifice, the honor and glory. What did any of it matter if it only produced more burning planes and bodies in the ocean? A Hellcat appeared in front of him, the American pilot clearly visible in his cockpit, and for a moment they flew parallel to each other, no more than 30 meters apart. Takeshi could see the man's face, young like his own, tense with concentration, hands steady on the controls. Their eyes met for perhaps 2 seconds, and in that brief moment of recognition, Takeshi saw not an enemy, but a mirror. Another young man, another pilot, another person caught in forces beyond his control, trying to survive. The American pilot's finger moved toward his trigger. Takeshi made his choice. He yanked the stick hard, diving again, but this time not to evade. He aimed for the clouds that had appeared on the horizon, thick cumulus formations that would provide cover. Behind him, he heard the rattle of machine gun fire, felt more impacts on his aircraft, but he didn't care. He pushed the throttle to maximum, coaxing every bit of speed from the damaged Zero. The radio exploded with voices. Saito's calm commands, other pilots' death screams, American fighters coordinating their attacks. Takeshi reached down and switched off his radio. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the roar of his own engine and the wind rushing past the canopy. He plunged into the clouds and disappeared. The Zero shuddered and bucked, the controls responding sluggishly. Black smoke was beginning to seep into the cockpit, and Takeshi could smell burning oil. The engine temperature gauge was climbing into the red. He had minutes at best before the aircraft became unflyable. He checked his compass and turned north, away from the American fleet, away from his target, away from his mission. For the 4th time, Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto was abandoning his kamikaze attack. But this time was different. This time, there would be no mechanical failure to blame, no enemy fighters to cite as justification, no weather conditions to hide behind. This time, he was choosing to live. The clouds eventually broke, revealing open ocean beneath him. Takeshi descended to wave-top level, conserving what fuel remained, hoping to avoid detection. The engine was coughing now, missing on at least one cylinder, and the controls felt like they were held together by wire and prayer. 30 kilometers from the coast, the engine finally seized with a grinding shriek of metal on metal. The propeller jerked to a stop, and suddenly the only sound was the wind and Takeshi's own breathing. He had perhaps 60 seconds before the Zero would hit the water. Takeshi didn't panic. Years of training took over. He jettisoned the canopy, unbuckled his harness, and prepared for water landing. The ocean rushed up to meet him, faster than he expected. At the last moment, he pulled back on the stick, trying to stall the aircraft just above the surface. The Zero hit the water hard, the impact slamming Takeshi against his restraints despite his preparation. Water immediately began flooding the cockpit. He pushed himself up and out, diving clear, just as the aircraft's tail rose up and the nose went under. Within seconds, the Zero had slipped beneath the waves, leaving only bubbles and debris on the surface. Takeshi floated in his life vest, watching the last traces of his aircraft disappear. Around him, the ocean stretched in every direction, indifferent to his survival or death. He thought of his father's words again about forces greater than war. He began swimming toward the coast. The swim took hours. Takeshi's arms and legs burned with exhaustion, his throat raw from salt water, his vision blurring from dehydration. Several times he thought about simply stopping, letting himself sink, ending it here in the ocean rather than facing what awaited him on land. But each time, something made him continue. stubbornness perhaps, or curiosity about what came next, or simply the fundamental human drive to survive. The sun was setting when his feet finally touched sand. He dragged himself onto a small beach, collapsing on the shore, too exhausted to move. Above him, the sky turned brilliant shades of orange and purple, beautiful and terrible, like everything about this war. He must have slept, because when he opened his eyes again, it was dark and someone was standing over him. Takeshi's hand went instinctively to his sidearm, but the holster was empty, lost somewhere in the ocean. "Easy, Lieutenant," a voice said in Japanese. "I'm not going to hurt you." Takeshi's vision focused on an old man, a fisherman by the look of his weathered face and simple clothing. He held a lantern in one hand and a fishing rod in the other. "The others," the old man said, gesturing toward the ocean. "Your squadron. They didn't come back, did they?" "No," Takeshi managed to say through cracked lips. The fisherman nodded slowly, unsurprised. "I've lived in this village for 70 years. I've seen many wars, many young men who went to fight and never returned, and I've seen a few, very few, who found their way back." He extended his hand. "Can you walk?" With the fisherman's help, Takeshi made it to a small village hidden in the coastal hills. The old man took him to his home, gave him water, rice, and a place to sleep. He asked no questions about why Takeshi was alone, why he had washed up on the beach instead of completing his mission. In the morning, reality crashed back in. Takeshi knew he couldn't stay here. The military police would be searching for him. When he didn't return to base, when the mechanics confirmed his aircraft had enough fuel to make the round trip, when they analyzed the pattern of his previous returns, they would understand what he had done. "You're thinking of going back," the fisherman said, preparing breakfast. "Turning yourself in." "I'm a deserter, a coward. I abandoned my mission, my duty, my comrades." "Or you're a survivor, a young man who chose life over death." The old man poured tea into 2 cups. "I had a son once. He was about your age when they took him for the war in China. He believed all the things they told him about honor and duty and sacrifice. He died believing them." The fisherman's hands trembled slightly as he set down the teapot. "I'm not sure any more that belief was worth his life." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that wars end, Lieutenant. This war will end, whether it takes 1 year or 5. And when it does, Japan will need young men like you to rebuild, not as martyrs, not as heroes in photographs, but as living, breathing people who can help create something better from the ashes." Takeshi stayed with the fisherman for 3 days, helping with the catch, mending nets, living a simple life that felt impossibly distant from the war. But on the 4th day, military police arrived in the village. Someone had reported seeing a pilot come ashore. The fisherman tried to hide him, but Takeshi wouldn't allow it. He walked out to meet them, hands raised, ready to accept whatever judgment awaited. The tribunal was held at Kanoya Air Base, in the same briefing room where Commander Nakamura had outlined his 4th mission. Takeshi stood before 3 senior officers, his uniform still salt-stained and torn, and listened as they read the charges: desertion in the face of the enemy, failure to complete assigned mission, conduct unbecoming of an officer, dishonor to the Emperor. Commander Nakamura was present but did not sit on the tribunal. He stood to the side, his face unreadable, as the evidence was presented. Radio intercepts from the battle, testimony from mechanics about the Zero's fuel capacity, analysis of weather conditions and enemy fighter positions. When asked to speak in his own defense, Takeshi stood silent for a long moment. Then he said simply, "I chose to live. I don't know if that makes me a coward or a traitor. But I chose to live because I stopped believing that my death would change anything. I watched good men die. I watched Ensign Tanaka, 19 years old, scream as his plane went down. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't add my name to that list for a cause that seemed, in that moment, futile and endless. The senior officers conferred quietly among themselves. According to military law, the penalty for desertion in wartime was clear: execution by firing squad. But something unexpected happened. The senior-most officer, a decorated admiral who had fought at Pearl Harbor, spoke. "Lieutenant Yamamoto, you are correct that your death would change nothing, but not for the reasons you think." He paused, shuffling papers on the desk. "The war is lost. We have known this for months, but we continue to send our young men to die because we don't know how to stop, because pride and honor have become chains that bind us to destruction." The other officers looked uncomfortable, but none contradicted him. The admiral continued, "You will be dishonorably discharged from the Imperial Japanese Navy. You will return to your family in disgrace, and you will live with the shame of your choice for the rest of your days. Some will call you a coward, some will call you wise. You will have to decide for yourself which is true." 3 months later, on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender over the radio. The war was over. Takeshi listened to the broadcast at his family's home in Yokohama, sitting beside his mother, both of them crying. Not from shame, not from grief, but from relief. Relief that it was finally over, that the dying would stop. In the years that followed, Takeshi struggled with what he had done. He faced ostracism from some, understanding from others. He never flew again. Instead, he became a teacher, working with children who had been orphaned by the war, both Japanese and American, trying to build something constructive from the ruins. He never called himself a hero, but he also stopped calling himself a coward. One day, 20 years after the war, a letter arrived from America. It was from a former Hellcat pilot named James Morrison, who had been researching the air battle that day in 1945. He had seen Takeshi's name in captured Japanese records and wanted to tell him something. "I think I met you that day," Morrison wrote. "There was a moment when we flew side by side, when we looked at each other. I had you in my sights, but something made me hesitate. Just for a second, but long enough for you to escape into the clouds. I've thought about that moment for 20 years, wondering why I didn't shoot. I think it's because in that instant I saw not an enemy, but another pilot, another human being who wanted to live. I'm glad you made it. I'm glad we both made it." Takeshi kept that letter until the day he died, at the age of 78, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. He had lived a long life, full and complicated, marked by both the shame of his choice and the quiet satisfaction of survival. On his deathbed, one of his granddaughters asked him about the war, about the Kamikaze missions, about the decision he had made. She had heard the stories, the whispers, the judgments. "Grandfather," she asked, "do you regret what you did? Turning back, choosing to live?" Takeshi looked at her, at his daughter holding his hand, at his son-in-law standing in the doorway, at the whole beautiful, messy family that existed because he had refused to die. "Every day of my life," he said honestly. "I regret the men who died while I lived. I regret my dishonor, my failure, but I also celebrate every sunrise I witnessed, every meal I shared, every student I taught, every one of you who exists, because I made that choice." He smiled weakly. "Regret and gratitude, shame and joy. They exist together, always. That is what it means to be human." He died peacefully that night, one of the few kamikaze pilots who refused to die when ordered, and lived long enough to see the country he loved rebuild itself into something the young pilot of 1945 could never have imagined. The divine wind had been meant to save Japan through sacrifice. But perhaps salvation came instead through those who chose to live, to remember, to teach future generations that there is no honor worth more than human life, no cause so sacred that it justifies the waste of young men in the name of glory. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto's grave sits in a quiet cemetery overlooking the ocean. His headstone bears no military honors, no mention of his service, only his name, his dates, and a simple inscription chosen by his family. He chose to live, and in living he gave others the gift of his story. And perhaps that was the greatest act of courage after all,